All right, welcome to Chapter 11, Part 1 of The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. We are just a few chapters away from finishing our story, which is kind of crazy. We started so long ago. So for your Chapter 11 activity, you're actually just going to be doing part of this vocabulary sheet because this relates to both Chapters 11, 12, and 13. So you will fill out a few of these after you've listened to both parts 1 and parts 2 of chapter 11. So the 5 vocabulary words for these chapters are voltage, devising, relish, conductor, and cyclone. And then they have the definitions there, and you're going to fill them into the blanks depending on which of those words are mentioned in chapter 11. So we're going to start with chapter 11, and the title of this chapter is The Windmill Comes to Life. Follow along with me on the screen. The following afternoon, I began assembling the machine. I dragged the bicycle, tractor van, blades, bolts, and dynamo outside and arranged them along the dirt. I had chosen an area behind the kitchen which doubled as my laboratory. The acai trees provided plenty of shade against the mid-morning sun, and I had also determined it was the ideal place to catch the eastern winds that rushed over the highlands from the lake. The first thing I wanted to do was connect the blades to the tractor fan. This called for a drill. So I went into the kitchen and stuck the cob-handled nail into the fire, and once it glowed hot, I bored a square pattern of 4 holes into the top of each plastic blade, plus 2 more in the center. This process of heating, melting, and reheating took nearly 3 hours. Next, I emptied the sack of nuts and bolts and Gilbert had given me on the ground and started to fasten the first blade. That's when I realized I'd forgotten the washers. "Ugh!" I shouted, frustrated with myself. Well, I definitely needed washers to secure the bolts, so I spent the next hour collecting bottle caps outside of Ophicia Boozing Center. Once I had about 20, I hurried home, hammered them flat, and used a nail to poke a hole through their middles. Perfect. One by one, I drove bolts through each washer and tightened the nuts until all 4 blades were connected. Lastly, I wanted to make sure the blades were strong and wouldn't snap in a heavy wind. So I wired 3-foot bamboo reinforcements to each one to where they acted like bones. "Okay now," I said, "let's have a look." I stood back to examine my work. From end to end, the wingspan of the blade stretched more than 8 feet, causing me to giggle with excitement. It was then that I noticed the compound was empty. My sisters were off running errands, and my father was attending a funeral in a nearby village. Besides my clinking and hammering, the only other noise was my mother humming to herself in the kitchen as she prepared a pot of beans for supper. The privilege of privacy was mine, and I fell into deep concentration. The next thing was to figure out how to connect everything to the bicycle, which wasn't going to be easy. I started by steadying the blades atop 4 tall bricks, like how a mechanic puts a car on blocks, so I would have some room to work underneath. Then came the hard part. The bicycle was not only heavy, but cumbersome, especially with the giant shock absorber sticking out from the crankset. But I managed to lift it high enough to flip it over, then drop the shock absorber into the center hole of the tractor fan. Quickly, I crouched down underneath the bricks and jammed a cotter pin through the other end, locking it tight. Finally, I attached the dynamo to the bike frame so its metal wheel hugged against the sidewall of the tire. I strung the chain, which was coated in warm black grease, over the crankset, and made sure it held tight against the sprockets. By the time I finished the chain, the sun was setting behind the trees, and soon it would be too dark to work. I packed my tools away in my room, then moved the windmill against the wall of the kitchen and out of the way. I drew a bucket of water from the well and heated it for my bath, and after bathing, headed inside for supper. But then my sister, Rose, had returned from the shops and saw me in the courtyard. "William, we haven't seen you all day," she said. "People in the trading center were asking about you." "Well, today your brother was busy," I said. "I told them you were playing with your metals to make power." "Something like that," I said, smiling. "Just wait. Soon you'll be in for a surprise, along with everyone else." I ate my supper like a real working man, saying nothing except to utter a few well-orchestrated grunts. When I finished eating, I returned to my room, lay down on my bed, and was asleep in seconds. The following morning, I was awake at first light and ready to continue. My plan was to build a tall wooden tower for the windmill, but first I had to see if it even worked. For this, I needed something temporary, so I found a thick piece of bamboo more than 6 inches wide and bored a hole through the top, then drove the other end into the dirt. I finished just in time to see Jeffrey ride up on his bicycle from Chapumba. It happened to be his day off, and he was coming to visit me. "Hey, man, just in time," I said. "Is this the same project you were working on?" "Yeah, this is everything. I'm glad you're here, friend. Help me lift this thing." We locked up the bicycle wheel and chain to keep them from spinning, then carefully hoisted the machine onto the pole. I was out of rope, so once it felt sturdy, Jeffrey secured it using long strips from an inner tube. "Shall we?" he asked. "We shall." Jeffrey unlocked the tires so the blades could spin, except we didn't realize how quickly this would happen. In Malawi, the wind is never still. Within seconds, the blades were spinning so fast the chain snapped in half and the pole nearly tipped over. "Hold it!" I shouted. Jeffrey and I barely managed to catch the machine before it crashed to the ground and broke apart. Once we had a grip, I twisted the pole and turned the blades out of the wind's direction. Then I spent the next 2 hours fixing the chain. The main reason for the test was to see if the dynamo produced enough current. I already knew it could power a small bicycle lamp, but what else? I went to my father's room and grabbed his international radio, which was forbidden to me, given my history with the family's other electronics. When I returned, Jeffrey gave me a look. "Does your father know you're borrowing this?" he asked. I waved him off. "He's in the trading center. He'll never know it was gone." I jammed the dynamo's 2 wires into the radio's AC socket, and Jeffrey unlocked the windmill blades. They began to twirl, and the dynamo's metal wheels zipped again against the spinning tire. For the slightest moment, I heard music. It worked! But a second later, black smoke started to pour out of the speakers. "Oh no!" Jeffrey said, and ripped out of the wires. The radio sat on the ground between us, sizzling like an egg. He spun around looking for my father, but I was too excited to care. "Did you see that power?" I screamed, jumping up and down. "Did you see it?" The radio blew up because the dynamo produced too many volts of electricity. Voltage, as I'd learned in my books, is how you measure electric pressure. Think of it like the water pressure coming out of a hose. The dynamo produced 12 volts when someone was pedaling like normal. This was enough for a radio or a light bulb to manage. But when the wind gusted and spun the blades like mad, it caused a power surge that increased the voltage and fried my father's radio. I had to figure out how to reduce it. I flipped through explaining physics to where it showed a diagram of 2 separate light bulbs, both being lit from a low 12-volt AC supply, exactly like my dynamo. Both bulbs were connected by long wires. One bulb burned very bright, all because of something called a transformer, which boosted the voltage and made it strong. But the second bulb didn't have a transformer and glowed dim and yellow. That's because without the transformer, power was lost in the form of heat on its journey through the wires, something called dissipation. "Mr. Jeffrey," I said, "since energy can be lost in the wires when traveling long distances, perhaps we can try this on the dynamo." I went into our big pile of radio parts and found an old motor. I cracked it open, removed the core, and unwound the long copper wire. I then wrapped it around a stick, creating my own kind of reverse transformer. I attached one end of the wire to the dynamo and the other end to my father's radio, which somehow managed to survive the power surge. Just like in the book, I was giving the electricity an extra long road to travel, hoping some of its voltage would get lost along the way. "Okay, try it again," I said to Jeffrey. He unlocked the blades, and the wheel and dynamo began to whir. This time, there was only music. Our test was complete. The windmill sat on the bamboo pole for 2 days, hidden behind the house and out of sight. In the meantime, Jeffrey Gilbert and I set out to build a real tower. The 3 of us met in front of my house one morning with our panga machetes and walked in the blue gum forest. It was the same grove of trees where I'd sought refuge from the bubblegum curse and where I'd accepted Shabani's magic, only to be beaten that day in Dawa. And now it was where I went to build my ladder to science. We walked through the forest, looking carefully at each tree. Finally, we chose one that was about 18 feet high. We tore into the trunk with our blades, and after 10 minutes, the tree crashed to the ground. We used our pangas to prune the branches, then stripped the thin bark with our hands. By 3 o'clock, we'd felled and cleaned 2 additional trees and were hoisting them onto our shoulders, headed home. Just behind the kitchen, we set the poles deep into the ground, each one the same distance from the other. Each pole was wrapped in jumbo bags to keep out the termites. We took smaller branches and nailed them sideways like rungs of a ladder, using nails that Jeffrey had bought using his pay from the maize mills. By sundown, the tower was complete. It stood 15 feet high and was remarkably sturdy. However, from just a short distance away, its long and spindly legs gave it the appearance of a wobbly giraffe. "Get some sleep, gents," I said. "Tomorrow we raise the machine." And that's where I'm going to stop for Chapter 11, Part 1. Go ahead to your journal, and you'll be able to fill in at least one of your vocabulary words on slide number 25 of your journal. And then once you're finished with that, you can stop, and we'll continue with Chapter 11, Part 2 tomorrow.